You're also going to hear some graphic stories of people who, certainly some of the lawsuits that were filed against Backpage. In order to understand why they filed the lawsuits, you have to hear what happened to these victims. So I'm giving that disclaimer ahead of time. So you'll see, just like Detective Morgan, I didn't post these ones online because I'm not going to post pictures of young girls online. I'm not going to republish it. But these are all things that I easily, I'm not being insensitive by showing you this. These are all things that you could easily have, I easily went on Backpage and pulled up. I didn't have to have some special password or some type of special access. Anyone could have gone on Backpage and found it. And you'll see things that I still find on Backpage now. So just a few disclaimers before we get started. Okay, first of all, just to kind of give you some background on how Backpage and just kind of sex websites fit in with sex trafficking. More than half of the sex trafficking victims out there are estimated to be 17 or younger. In the last 5 years, according to the recommendations of the Senate committee that looked at Backpage, and that's chaired by Rob Portman, who is one of our senators here in Ohio. There's been an 846% increase in reports of suspected child sex trafficking, and that's directly correlated to the increased use of internet. So I think a lot of us that are advocates in this area, when we get asked, why do you have this staggering amount of sex trafficking, especially this summer with the RNC, we had folks coming from all around the world who came and talked to us. And here in the United States, we're really the inverse of the rest of the world, where generally for human trafficking, when you talk about those 21 million victims, 3/4 of them are labor victims, and 1/4 of them are sex trafficking victims. Here in the US, it's the inverse, where 3/4 of our victims are estimated to be sex trafficking victims, and only 1/4 are labor trafficking victims. So when I'm asked why that is, I have two answers. First, I think we're not good at ferreting out labor trafficking here in the US, but also, when I'm asked about why we have such a staggering amount of sex trafficking, my answer is internet, 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 internet. So that's why I'm talking about this today. Why is trafficking sex online really made it stagger to higher numbers? Is because it's just like any business, it allows traffickers to traffic at higher profitability with lower risk. So for Backpage alone, 80% of their revenue was coming from online commercial sex advertising in the US. For the individual traffickers, you saw some of the different type of trafficking that goes on. And you heard it from some of our other presenters. Those that walk the strip with their traffickers are much more in line of the detectives. They can easily spot them. But if you're going to be a trafficker with your stable of women and you go ahead and put them online, and you saw Detective Morgan showing you just when he Googled one name how many different sites this woman was advertised on. You can advertise for very low money on many different sites and bring lots of money in with a very low level of detection. You're not out on the streets. You're not making yourself visible to the cops or to the investigators. Backpage's profits have really reached astronomical heights over the last few years. Based on primarily their commercial sex advertising. In 2008, their revenue was estimated at $5.3 million, jumping up to $135 million in 2014, which is a lot of money. So we'll talk about as we move along. That may be why Backpage really fought to keep from taking its adult section down. Backpage's adult section was the leading forum for unlawful sexual commercial advertisement on the internet. And this is according to Dart versus Backpage, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Dart was the sheriff in Cook County. As far as children being trafficked, there have been more than 400 document cases in 47 states. attributed to Backpage. And I think Detective Morgan did a good job earlier of telling you it's to the point where it was very rare that we didn't have one of our cases or any of our cases that there wasn't some Backpage listing associated with this victim. Here's a quote from a Backpage survivor. She said, "You can't buy a child at Walmart, but you can go to Backpage and buy me on Backpage." So going back to what we talked about before, where it really reduces not just women, but children, both boys and girls, to commodities. Here's an example. Again, kind of going back to what Detective Morgan says. If you that think this person is 23, like she says she is, I also would have a great piece of land to sell you as well. So we'll talk about as we move along what the rules are for posting folks online and how Backpage got around those. Here's another quote this is from a district attorney, which basically just summarized it, saying it's a dystopian hell. So what I'm going to talk about is kind of the 4 main areas where folks have waged war against Backpage. The credit card industry, the civil lawsuits, criminal lawsuits, and then finally the government, which is probably the one you heard the most about. With respect to credit cards, the sheriff in Cook County called on credit cards back in July 2015 to cease making online payments to Backpage. Specifically, if it was the adult escort services, he sent out letters to MasterCard, American Express, Visa, all of the major credit cards, and said, hey, these guys basically are scumbags, and stop letting them make money off of the backs of children and women being exploited. Backpage, in response, sued and said that the sheriff is violating their free speech and equal protection rights. The district court denied Backpage's motion and said, look, Backpage can't contend that it's irrelevant that MasterCard and Visa maybe just don't want to do business with someone who peddles flesh. So you can't blame the sheriff if they decide we don't want anything to do with you because this is unseemly what you're getting involved with. Unfortunately, the appellate court reversed and granted the preliminary injunction against the sheriff, saying you can't be reaching out to these credit card companies and saying don't do business with them. And what they said is, look, even though he didn't say, hey, you do this or you're in trouble, the court still looked at it as it's effectively a cease and desist letter. When you, as a government official, are reaching out to credit card agencies and saying, look, it's in your best interest to stop doing business with this company because it's engaging in illegal behavior, they feel a lot of pressure to not then do business with this company. So you can't do that. You need to cease and desist from doing that. You can't keep sending letters to MasterCard, Visa, et cetera. Nevertheless, the credit card companies, even after he stopped, still said, we don't want to do business with you. So MasterCard, Visa, American Express, they all went bye-bye. They no longer do business with Backpage. But Backpage didn't miss a beat. They started accepting Bitcoin, which I don't really understand, but maybe some of you do. I've never bought anything with Bitcoin. But apparently it's very easy to get. You can just go right online and get Bitcoin and make purchases with that. So here were the projected net revenues once they switched over. This was according to, as we'll get to later, the subcommittee that investigated Backpage once they had switched over completely to Bitcoin. So as you see, they did not skip a beat at all. If anything, they expected their revenues to continue going up once they were accepting Bitcoin and not accepting any, well, no credit cards would do business with them. They would have been more than happy to accept credit cards, but none of them were doing business with them. So that's the credit cards. The credit cards dumped Backpage, but Backpage is completely fine, doesn't miss a beat. Civil lawsuits. Young victims started coming forward, and this was very few and far between, most of them did not, but a few started coming forward and having the bravery to talk about what happened to them and saying, look, at least some of this is attributable to my being advertised on Backpage. So in order to have their voice be heard, they took it to the courts, and they said they found attorneys who are willing to represent them and who sued Backpage. And pretty much all the lawsuits, it was at least 3 or 4 young victims, and I'll talk to you about some of their stories, who talked about what their situation were and how they were exploited, and said, look, Backpage, you're essentially complicit, and I don't mean criminally, these weren't the criminal lawsuits, but you were part of the cause of my victimization. So the first big case was Doe versus Backpage.com, and this was in Massachusetts. Jane Doe number 1, she was 15 years old. Between June of 2013 and September, so this is about 3 months, her services were advertised on Backpage every single day. She appeared on some 300 ads on Backpage, engaged in 10 to 12 sex transactions daily with adult men in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. They talked about the fact that for this particular individual, Backpage used, or the advertisers used, known signifiers for child prostitution. So young, girl, fresh, tiny, roses. So I'm just going to stop for a second here, because when we're talking about child victimization on Backpage and advertising children on Backpage, you'll never pull up someone on Backpage or on any other website that they'll say, hi, I'm 15, come and engage in sex with me. That's never going to happen, because that won't get past any government regulation. So what we found is that Backpage, as well as some other websites that I'll mention to you, will use some of these known signifiers so that those in the know that I might post and say I'm 18, but I'm really not 18 because I'm using these little known signifiers like fresh, roses, those kind of buzzwords, so that you know that I'm really not 18. So those are some of the things that certainly the government looked at as well. In fact, if you try to attempt to, let's say I'm 15 and I'm posting an ad, or my pimp is having me post my ad, if I try to enter my true age, Backpage will instruct you. No, you have to enter your age as 18 or older, so it'll kick it back to you. It won't delete your ad, it won't get rid of it, it won't say go away, it'll just kick it back and say, no, just enter 18 or older. Oops, sorry, the ad poster must be over 18 years of age. You can immediately plug in the greater age without submitting any additional information and proceed with the submission. Jane Doe number 2, she was trafficked on Backpage for 2 years between 2010 and 2012. Started also when she was 15 years old. Her ads appeared on average 6 times per day. So Backpage, the way that they do it is this will refresh so that you can pay a little extra, or you can do a little extra for enhancements. You can run ads as early as 6 in the morning. You can run them 24 hours a day, but you can have them pop up multiple times a day, and you can even change them so that, hey, now I'm at this location. Now I'm doing out calls rather than just in calls. So having them appear multiple times a day is not unusual. Ads resulted in her having sex 5 to 15 times per day. She said she was raped over 900 times while under the control of her pimp. Jane Doe number 3, trafficked on Backpage in December of 2013 by her pimp and his associates. The Backpage ads described her as, quote, new. Again, one of those signifiers, sweet, playful. Again, those keywords that folks are looking for that are kind of in the know as to whether or not she's underage and young. She was taken to a hotel in Foxborough, Massachusetts, raped by men who responded to the ads. In the briefing for this case, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children filed an amicus brief, which is like a friend of the court brief, saying, hey, we're really in favor of you imposing sanctions and here in favor of this civil suit against Backpage. And they showed some examples of ads that they see that come across their desk. So this is a couple examples. You know, hey, newbie, tiny here. I look very young, but I'm 19 years old. Talking about I'm shy. I'm legal and ready. All those kind of signifiers to let people know I'm not really 19. Exotic, young, and inexperienced, saying that they're 18. I just got started. Again, kind of those key words to let people know that you're getting someone that's underage and probably really young. So the legal arguments that they had here, you saw kind of some of the facts. The legal arguments were that, look, Backpage structured their whole adult section to lightly, ever so lightly, camouflage illegal content to divert law enforcement. So of course, it's not completely in law enforcement's face saying, hey, here's 13-year-olds, here's 14-year-olds, but they did structure it so that they could still essentially peddle flesh and peddle young women and get away with it. How do they do this? Because you're allowed to enter a phony age. You're allowed to enter phone numbers in non-traceable ways. So this is a big one that you'll see a lot when you pull up Backpage or some of the other websites, is you enter the numericals and then you enter other number, like the number spelled out, and then numerical again. So that way, the investigators can't trace it. So when you see that there's a phone number that keeps coming back, that, oh wow, these are 4 girls that are all going to the same phone number. In other words, they're probably being pimped out. You don't put it together because you can't really trace that when it's numbers and letters being spelled out. So it's ways to get around that in order to make it difficult to trace. They would strip out metadata. So when you talk to, and this is something that certainly Detective Morgan has talked about on other occasions, a huge thing that law enforcement does, and maybe some of you have heard about that new app that came out where you go to hotel rooms and take pictures of hotel rooms. Well, part of the thing that we do with that is then they put it into a system, and everywhere you are, everywhere they are, has metadata embedded into those pictures. And so it goes into a system that investigators use. The photographs that were going into here were being stripped of all that metadata. So the investigators couldn't use the pictures. So when they were trying to get the metadata to see location, time, those type of signifiers to help them find these girls, they couldn't get anything out of it. So the legal claims were the violation of the Victims Protection Act, which was the act that I told you at the very beginning of today, that was passed in 2000, of trafficking, unfair protection claims, and then other torts like right of publicity, copyright infringement, etc. The big thing that Backpage used, and it's not just Backpage, you will see that other much more reputable internet sites have run to Backpage's defense, like Yahoo, Facebook, all sorts of sites have said, no, you can't sue Backpage. And the reason why is the Communications Decency Act, which was passed, this section was passed in the mid-90s. And I mean, think about what was going on then. Remember how the internet was really just kind of burgeoning. And Congress, in order to facilitate that, came up with this exemption for third-party internet content. And what that means is, if I'm just providing a web service, like Yahoo, like Google, like Facebook, and someone comes on and publishes something, but I'm not providing the content, then I can't be liable. And the reason that they came up with this was that they were really trying to encourage the proliferation of the internet at that time. It was, seen as something that was very important, that was providing, the information highway, and that sort of thing. And if we didn't have that, then folks really weren't going to go out on a limb and create these different websites that in some respects can be very good. So that was their key defense, was that, look, we didn't post this ad. Someone else posted this ad on our website. The response was, and the purpose, as I just said, was the rapidly developing array of the internet. The plaintiff's argument was like, look, things have really changed since that came out. The principal policy behind that exemption just isn't present anymore. If anything, we need to start looking at the other side of the internet and the fact that perhaps we need to start regulating who's putting what on the internet and whether they have some liability, especially as I'll talk about as we move along. When the Senate started doing their investigation of Backpage with very little to no cooperation from Backpage, they found out that Backpage was pretty involved in the content that went on their website. So the Massachusetts lawsuit did what most other lawsuits did, like any lawsuit of Facebook or any other third-party website, and said, no, you don't have a lawsuit because of the Communications Decency Act. They said the court's not unsympathetic to these defendants, but we don't see the affirmative participation or any type of active website creation here. We just don't see it. So our hands are tied, essentially, is what the court said. Just some anecdotal data of what we saw, just that kind of goes along with this lawsuit. In the RNC, some of my students would monitor the Backpage during the RNC, and we saw some of these same tattoos. We talked about the branding, and this tattoo in particular was associated with a porn star escort site that was listed in multiple cities. We saw a lot of identical templates. So you see here, this is for two different women or girls, but they have the exact same template as far as what you must ask for. Absolutely, no pics, same phone number, young children. And this was all here in Cleveland during the Republican National Convention. The same non-numerical phone numbers, lots of these showed up during the Republican National Convention. And then that takes us to, there were certainly a couple other unsuccessful civil suits, but that takes us to the first one that kind of swung the other way. This was in September of 2015. JS v. Backpage, this involved 3 girls as well that were forced into prostitution. They were in 7th and 9th grades. JS was 15 years old. She was pimped out by her pimp, advertised on Backpage over 100 times. The ad language said things like, well worth it, $150 an hour. It won't take long at all. Because of the ads, she engaged in sexual intercourse with adult customers multiple times per day for several months. The next victim was 13, ran away from home and introduced to these pimps, 2 pimps. They dressed her in lingerie and took pictures of her to create ads for Backpage. She engaged in sexual activities with many, many adult men, is how she described it. The last one was a month out of 7th grade, LC. She left home and was introduced to these, all of them were dealing with the same pimps. Defendant Rice invited her to live with them. She then told her that if she was going to stay, she needed to work, kind of the typical at first, very kind, very friendly, provides them with some place to stay. And then faced with being homeless, she agreed. Advertised on Backpage between July and September 2010. Here's how they called her Tasha. I'm not going to say that, but that's how they advertised her. As a result of the ads, she was raped by hundreds of adult customers, as many as 20 per day. And here's what they talked about, again, pointing to some of the tools that Backpage would use to slide these ads through under government detection. So these were some of Backpage's instructions. Don't paste or post naked images, bare butts, nipples, sex acts, etc. Pricing for legal adult services must be for a minimum of an hour. So it's okay to do it for an hour, but you can't, if you do it for less than that, you get flagged as selling sexual sex for hire. I don't know why it doesn't get flagged for an hour. That'll be a question that, don't ask me to answer that question, but apparently that slides through and the government doesn't flag that. Don't use code words like Greek, blow, girlfriend experience, those kind of things. Don't suggest an exchange of sex acts for money, so don't come out and specifically say $100 for me having sex with you. Don't come out and actually say it. Don't post content which advertises an illegal service. The plaintiff's argument, again, very similar to the other ones, was that, look, this is doing all of this and showing these ads and talking about what happened with these individuals was that you're not a neutral intermediary like Google or, I hate to say Facebook because I don't think Facebook is always a neutral intermediary either. So I'm gonna say Google or Yahoo for now. That is just hosting, just a host of information. You're actually transforming yourself into original speaker by providing these instructions, and as I'll talk about later, by moderating and even editing some of the ads. So the court said, look, the whole case turns on whether Backpage merely hosted the ads, because if that's all they're doing, they clearly have immunity under the Decency Act, the Communications Decency Act. But if they even helped to develop the content, then there's a real question as to whether they have the right to take advantage of that immunity. So the Supreme Court went all the way up to the Washington Supreme Court, and they affirmed, and this is the first time that this has happened, the denial of Backpage's motion to dismiss. And they said, look, we have to figure out whether Backpage designed its posting rules to induce sex trafficking. So they sent it back down, and it's still in the trial court, and so we're still waiting to see what's gonna happen in the trial court. But it's the first time that a civil suit has moved forward against Backpage. And this is my favorite quote from the Washington Supreme Court. They said, the Communications Decency Act was not meant to create a lawless no man's land on the internet. So basically saying, look, this has to stop somewhere. So we've talked about, check my timing, okay. We've talked about the credit cards and about the civil suits. This is probably the one that most of you have heard about, Backpage have heard about, which is the government, the government who actually, under Rob Portman, who chaired the committee, looked into. So the US Subcommittee on Investigations decided a couple years ago to look into sex trafficking on the internet, and very quickly started really zoning in on Backpage when they realized that the great majority of the ads that are being posted are on Backpage. So what the government started looking at when they looked at Backpage and what they're doing specifically and how these ads get published is, first of all, how does Backpage edit these ads? So we already talked about that they give instructions that might facilitate some of these ads advertising young girls or young boys. But more specifically, how do they edit them once they come in? Because if you're editing, you're getting somewhat involved in content, right? You could be. You could not be, but you could be. So we'll talk about that. And then how do they strip out certain content? So if you strip out certain content to make it so it's not obvious that it's illegal, now it's looking legal, but everyone knows it's illegal, is that being complicit in a crime? So that was the question that the government really focused on. So Backpage has what's called moderators. Everyone has moderators. Facebook has moderators. All of these people have moderators. And it's just a nice word for editors, for things that come across before they put them out on the website. Craigslist has it, those type of things. Their job is to review and edit the ads that go on. So the fact that they have moderators in and of itself is not an unusual thing. The unusual thing, I hope, is what these moderators actually do. So the Backpage moderators, as the Senate started looking into things, and especially they got a couple whistleblowers, so they got a couple ex-moderators who were willing to talk to them. If not, they wouldn't have gotten some of this information at all, was that if you have violations, so in other words, if you get an ad that is clearly advertising sex for money, if it's an adult or a child, that's illegal. So if you get an ad that is violative, they were generally instructed, don't remove it. Instead, edit it so that you can still maintain the essence of the ad. So that was generally what their slogan was. That was their kind of mantra was, hey, as much as possible, let's try to keep these ads so that they're still getting what they want for their money, and we're not being too obtrusive in our editing. Here's a direct quote from Carl Ferrer, who is the CEO. He's the head honcho of Backpage. And this is an email that he wrote. So removing bad pics and removing text like 15 minutes and a half hour is critical. I think the moderators will be busy. So again, not saying, hey, if people are saying 15 minutes or a half hour, they're advertising sex for money and we shouldn't be putting them on our website because that's illegal. I'm just saying we need to get more moderators because this will take more time to edit it out so that they can go ahead and advertise sex for money. If in doubt, these are the moderator's instructions about underage, accept the ad and note the link for later. So if a moderator really felt unsafe, or that, wow, this person really seems young, they were told, go ahead and accept the ad, but note the link in case it comes up later, in case we have to flag it later. Again, with underage ads, this is a direct quote from their instructions. Only delete if you are really sure the person is underage. So again, hopefully you're getting some sense of what kind of pressure these moderators were under as far as what they were supposed to do with these ads. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you for a couple minutes about a lovely site called the Erotic Review. How many of you are familiar with this? I'm hoping none of you, but I wasn't until pretty recently. So there is, like many sites that are out there, a site called the Erotic Review, which the whole purpose of this site is for Johns or customers to go on and rate prostitutes, rate their experience, and to talk amongst themselves about what these girls are willing to do, what these women are willing to do, maybe men are willing to do as well. And it's really disgusting and unsavory. And actually, I was at a presentation this summer where a district attorney, they did a whole sting just on the Erotic Review where they found a bunch of men that were coordinating and essentially pimping women through the Erotic Review saying, hey, make sure we talk this one up and make sure we talk this one up, basically making sure that the women in their stable were getting talked up. And these were really successful businessmen. I mean, men you would never guess in a million years that would be involved in this. And they would meet at like a family restaurant and just talk about their little business, their little side business. It was just absolutely horrific. So anyway, the reason I bring up the Erotic Review is that the Erotic Review has a unique kind of 6 or 7 digit number, which is where you can look this person up according to their 6 or 7 digit number and find out their rating on the Erotic Review. So that's another flag for government. The government does know about this. The investigators know about this. So if you're saying something like, hey, look up my review on blah, 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 or blah, 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 that should be flagged. But the Backpage was trying to get around this by the way that they would flag their ads. So what they would do was say, if you say TER number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it would get flagged. If you said well-reviewed and then the little number mark, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or Google My Reviews, number mark, it wouldn't get flagged. So if it didn't have the words the erotic review or TER, it wouldn't get flagged. So they figured out ways to edit it to make sure this wouldn't get flagged. So clearly, when you're saying look up my reviews on the erotic review, you're advertising sex, because you're saying, look at how I've been reviewed as a prostitute. Hiding data. The government looked into the fact that, as I mentioned before, they don't retain metadata associated with the images posted on site, which can be a real difficulty for investigators. The metadata is kind of that forensic footprint for those pictures so that you can then find where those people are. And it's really concerning that they're going out of their way to strip the metadata. Why? Why are you stripping the metadata for these pictures? Why would you even go to that trouble to strip the metadata for those pictures? So they also looked at their corporate structure and finances, their revenue from adult advertisements, and their revenue from their online escort advertising. They realized that Backpage has several other associated websites, so it's not just Backpage. They have bigcity.com, evilempire.com, nakedcity.com. So it wasn't just Backpage. I mean, they actually branched out to make more money off of essentially exploiting people online. So Naked City, for instance, is the world's largest online directory of twerking booty videos. That's how it's advertised. That's the advertisement for Naked City. It links directly to Backpage ads and has these pictures of women, and then most of them are twerking in some respect. So after looking into this, the government issued a subpoena saying, hey, Backpage, you have to give over some of your information. How do your moderators edit these ads? What kind of data do they retain? And then we also want information on your corporate structure, because it all seems very confusing. Backpage responded by refusing to produce most of the documents. They ended up producing 16,000 pages, 16,838 pages, but 16,000 of those, or 96%, were just responses to other government subpoenas. So they weren't responsive to this subpoena. It was just things that they had already handed over before in response to other subpoenas. So essentially kind of a smack in the face to this actual investigation. Carl Ferrer was then subpoenaed to come and testify. And as you can see, he's not there. He didn't feel like he had to show up. So in response, the Senate panel decided to initiate civil contempt proceedings against Backpage. This was about a year ago, and this is the first time in over 20 years that that's happened. So this is why maybe some of you have heard about this, because it's pretty unusual for the Senate to hold a company in contempt. Claire McCaskill, who is the other co-chair along with Rob Portman, said this is the height of arrogance, and she's disgusted with any company that wouldn't participate and cooperate with an investigation into trafficking of children. If Backpage thinks they are going to go quietly into the night, they are sadly mistaken. And she was right about that. The government did not go away. So the government then filed with the District Court for the District of Columbia to seek an order forcing Ferrer to comply with the subpoena. Backpage responded by saying, look, this is violative of our First Amendment rights. So, you have your right to free speech. And Backpage said, if you're gonna force us to turn over these documents, then you're intruding on our protected speech. Backpage also said, look, this is so overbroad. The things that you're asking us for, you need to be more specific, because if you're asking us for what our moderators do and what type of metadata we retain, you need to be much more specific, because we couldn't possibly give you this information based on the subpoena that you issued. Backpage and Ferrer also claimed, and have since claimed, that you're just singling us out because we make a lot of money, because we're making a lot of money and you're trying to punish us. The district court rejected Backpage's claims and said the subpoena is enforceable. This was in August. Then it went up to the appellate court. They granted a temporary stay, but then as they looked at it, they also issued an order enforcing the subpoena. That was in September. And then, of course, it went up to the US Supreme Court, which this is probably what most of you heard about. The Supreme Court ended up looking at it, first granted a stay, but then did the same thing. Once they looked at it, they said, no, this subpoena is perfectly valid. It's not asking for that much. It's pretty specific in what it's asking for, and there's no reason why you can't comply. So this was the middle of September, just this past September. Backpage produced some documents, but withheld a lot, claiming attorney-client privilege and a bunch of other defenses. This is still pending in a DC appellate court, federal appellate court. Meanwhile, I had to figure out how to structure this because a lot's going on with Backpage. Carl Ferrer gets arrested. He steps off a plane from a trip and gets arrested, handcuffed and everything. This is his mugshot. And the state of California filed criminal charges against him, Michael Lacey and James Larkin. Those are his two main partners at Backpage and the affiliated companies. And here were kind of the stories, some of the stories of the victims. Example is LF. She was 15 years old. She met her 32-year-old pimp, Patrick, online, began sexting with him. So this kind of goes back to what we talked about before, where the internet, I know that Karen talked about this, and so did Teresa, about how the internet is can be a really scary place. I mean, I know that I did a presentation just on the cases in the last year, and almost every single one of the cases of child trafficking, the girls or boys were recruited online through Facebook, through some type of social network, and these pimps recruited them online. So she met Patrick. 2 months later, they began a sexual relationship. Then, of course, it turned into a guerrilla pimp situation where he started beating her, forced her to turn over all her money from her prostitution. The police found 4 Backpage ads for her at the time that they picked her up. So the criminal charges were 4 counts of pimping, 3 counts of pimping minors under 16. And the prosecutor said that, look, he lived and derived support and maintenance in whole or in part from the earnings and proceeds of prostitution. So knowing that these women were prostitutes, he actually got money and derived some type of support and maintenance from this. Their response to this, Backpage's response to this was, first of all, First Amendment again, that, look, I'm a publisher and you're chilling my free speech. Of course, the Communications Decency Act, that I have immunity. I'm just a website provider, so how can I be responsible for these ads of these young girls? And then finally, just the merits on the criminal counts. He said, I didn't know any of these defendants, so I didn't know that they were prostitutes. So how can you say that I have the requisite intent to say that knowing that they were prostitutes, I took their money? The court granted Backpage's motion to dismiss and essentially said, again, for that Communications Decency Act, look, there's immunity. And the court said that they, at most, republished material, but it was material that was created by a third party. And Congress is the one who spoke on this matter by enacting the Communications Decency Act. If Congress wants to change it, Congress can change it, but that's for Congress and not this court to revisit, is what the court said. But the state of California is not giving up. The state of California, in the end of December, so just a couple months ago, refiled, this time really focusing on money laundering, 24 counts of money laundering against these 3 individuals. They did also file the pimping charges again against these individuals as well. The defendants moved to dismiss, again, with the same defenses, and asked for the same judge who handled the first case. The judge hasn't ruled on that yet. Meanwhile, we're kind of back to the government with respect to them looking at this. Elizabeth McDougall, which is the one we hear from the most because she is their attorney, and she is constantly talking about the fact that, look, you want Backpage to go away, but do you really want Backpage to go away? Which kind of goes with what Detective Morgan talked about earlier. And I'm very honest about this. It's a double-edged sword, because while I certainly think that Backpage profited off of the backs of young girls and young women, they are an effective way to find victims. And I will say that all the investigators I work with do say that they are very compliant with subpoenas. So when there's a subpoena issued, they generally comply in 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, especially if it's a child, they do comply. So the question is, if people are now going to migrate to other websites, and what if that website's abroad? Then we don't even have subpoena power over them to make them comply. That's kind of a scary proposition. So that's kind of been her position, which makes sense, but is also kind of disgusting. Like, hey, if we stop advertising sex, maybe, to go somewhere else where you can't reach them. But she says, the taking down the adult category of Backpage is not an effective countermeasure, because the content will someone else is just going to do it. Like, this is the attorney for Backpage. And she says, what terrifies me is the notion that what is going to happen here is going to go onto those black websites or the underground websites and ultimately the offshore websites, which I was just talking about. And then no one's going to care about cooperating with the law enforcement. So that's what terrifies her. Is that it doesn't terrify her that her company is actually advertising sex, but anyway. So when she was asked, it's supposed to be a picture of her, but it's not showing. When she was asked, the city of New York had hearings where they were trying to decide whether or not to take action against Backpage, and they interviewed her, and they talked about why won't you just admit that you're involved in sex trafficking? And so they drew correlations between sex trafficking and drug trafficking. So they asked her, okay, well, are you thinking of setting up a drug dealing section of the Backpage website? Because how is this any different? How is what you're doing any different than drug dealing? And her response was, I refuse to answer that question. And then they said, how about gun trading? Are you going to set up a gun trading or weapons trading section? And she said again, I refuse to answer that question. And she went on to say, look, the key to disrupting and ending human trafficking is to have a service provider community of businesses, including Backpage, that monitors and traces potential traffic cases and promptly reports and cooperates with law enforcement. So going back again to, look, at least we cooperate. At least once you find someone and you issue a subpoena, we'll cooperate. Do you really want to be dealing with companies that won't? So this is from an attorney, though, who takes a different view. Backpage will look you in the eye and tell you they are part of the solution. I don't believe that for a second. They are the platform by which children are bought and sold. So then, as probably some of you have heard, Backpage seemingly capitulates somewhat. They shut down the adult ad section just about a month and a half ago, hours before the Senate hearing where Ferrer and his cohorts were finally supposed to testify. But they did not testify. They showed up and they all pled the fifth, including their attorney, including she did as well. So that's still up in the air as well. And the question was, from everyone kind of in the advocacy area, like we all kind of looked at ourselves like, okay, where do we go now? Because we all hated Backpage, but then where is the advertising going to go? And is this really a victory, or is this really just kind of just a minor disruption? So Andrea Powell from Fair Girls, who's a big advocate in this area, says this is just a publicity stunt that's meant to disorient advocates and mislead the Senate. I'm still seeing teenage girls ads by the hour. Rob Portman spokesman said, "This shows just how unserious Backpage is about protecting women and young girls. It also underscores the need for long-term solution to ensure that Backpage and other websites can never facilitate this type of criminal sex trafficking again." So, as Detective Morgan said, they definitely have switched locations. So when I talk to folks in the last month or so, I say, again, if you don't think that there's advertising going on Backpage, you're kidding yourself. It's definitely still going on Backpage. As Detective Morgan said, it's now under the Cleveland dating section, women seeking men seeking men, women seeking women. So now it's under there as well. So here's just an example of, I just went on and just pulled up an ad, but there's tons and tons of them under there. This is an assistant state attorney. There's criticisms going all around. There's criticisms of Backpage. There's also criticisms of the government. And this is an assistant state attorney saying, "It would be a mistake for investigators or prosecutors to assume that trafficking will just decrease because of the shutdown of Backpage's escort ads. In fact, investigators and prosecutors must now be even more proactive and resourceful to uncover trafficking that is occurring on lesser-known websites, including other areas of Backpage." So this kind of goes back to what Detective Morgan says. So certainly it's in some ways probably surface victory, but how deep does that victory really go? I think that's kind of the $100 million question. Here's a criminology witness from George Mason who said it's a symbolic crusade about the government, again, criticizing. They're trying to get some accolades and look like the heroes, but it's having a negative effect on the ability for law enforcement to rescue victims and prosecute offenders. The best we can do is facilitate the capabilities of the police to investigate. So that's kind of where we are with Backpage. There still are real issues as to whether Backpage can be held for criminal liability for what they were involved with, and whether they're going to be forced at some point to have to testify in front of the Senate committee. At this point, that's really up in the air. If they're pleading the fifth, that will be hard to kind of get beneath. But as I said, their defenses on the original subpoena are still pending in the federal appellate court. So this saga is going to still go on. And if it isn't for Backpage, it's going to switch to another website. I mean, it was Craigslist up until 2010. Craigslist used to be that kind of the biggest advertiser for commercial sex until 2010. And then they took it off their website under a lot of pressure from folks. So this is stuff we all need to know because first of all, I don't think Backpage is going anywhere. But secondly, even if it does, this is certainly going to migrate. A lot of this is going to just migrate to another website under another name. So, any questions?
What does Rosie mean anyway?
I have no idea because I'm not in the know for that. It's just there's just certain folks that I guess are in the know, and it is a signifier that makes that if you know and I know, it means that I'm young. It's just a way of saying that I'm young without making it obvious to the government officials.
Maureen, just to back up what you're saying, the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking is hoping to bring to Cleveland the movie called I Am Jane Doe, which is a documentary approach to what you just did and the whole Backpage controversy. So we hope to do it in early May, and if you just go to the Facebook for the Collaborative, you'll be able to find out what date and all the specifics. But it certainly, you've given the foundation, and then the movie contributes to the conversation, and we'll just keep it going. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Karen.
Thank you. As always, it's fascinating to see the work that's being done. Backpage presents a common problem, right? It's not just here, but across a lot of internet providers. So you see this kind of safe harbor provisions in different aspects of internet. You see this sometimes in copyright, and you see this in other areas where in copyright there are takedown provisions. that are meant to sort of provide a safe harbor for the Facebooks and the Yahoos and the Googles of the world from being held liable for copyright infringement. And the approach there has generally been one of sort of regulating the actor so that, to some extent, you don't impose too much liability on them, but nevertheless impose a certain amount of what it is they're allowed to do, the kind of action they're allowed to do. And the Communication Decency Act is relatively broad, but I think has been interpreted much more broadly than people had expected it to be at the time, that the safe harbor essentially is a big, huge tunnel through which you could drive a Mack truck through.
Right.
What's the legislative strategy here to think through what the approach should be? Because fairly clearly we're not going to get rid of ISP hosts and people putting material up, and whack-a-mole can be really hard trying to figure out how to exactly corral the language that people should be using. So what's the legislative approach here to preventing advertising that may or may not be related to this that would hold these firms liable but nevertheless reduce the amount of harm that comes from this kind of advertising?
I think there does have to be a legislative approach, because I think if we're leaving it up to the courts, then we're going to be all over the place, right? Like we're going to have, and certainly on the federal level, we're going to have a circuit split, which is what we're pretty much at the point where we're having. I mean, even right now, Washington Supreme Court, that's a state court. So really, how much sway is that going to hold on other courts with respect to civil suits in particular? So we're going to keep coming across this with the Communications Decency Act, and you're absolutely right, where it's being interpreted certainly more broadly than I think. It's kind of the same thing when you look at a contract. You look at what was the intent of the parties at the time it was made. Same thing with a statute. What was the interpretation at the time it was made? And that's what all of these advocates are trying to argue, which is, look, back in the mid-'90s, there was a certain intent for why Section 230 was there, and that intent probably wasn't even for this anyway, but certainly has changed now. Like, we have to have legislation that reflects that. And I think it would be easy enough to go back and push Congress, and we have people like Rob Portman and others that are lawmakers that should be pushing on that front to say, look, what's the difference between a completely uninvolved third party who is just putting up basically a blank slate for people to publish their whatever they want to publish, and someone who is involved? And we have to clarify that, I think, legislatively. I think if we don't clarify that, then we're going to be going down, we're going to have all these costly lawsuits, we're going to have these criminal prosecutions and everything else. I mean, there's nothing really to indicate that they're going to have any more luck with this money laundering charge than they did with the pimping charges based on the current legislation. Because I think, as you just said, the Communications Decency Act has been interpreted so broadly that it's kind of an easy get out of jail card for the judge, right? To just say, I mean, it's so broad that as much as I sympathize with you, plaintiffs, or I sympathize with you, victims of a criminal act, I just can't go there. So I completely agree. Something has to be done legislatively. And I think we have to do a better job of defining legislatively, which we did not do when this section came out, of what exactly does that mean when you're saying a third-party website developer, and what's the difference between someone who's clearly just doing that and someone who's actively participating? Because for Backpage, I think that some of this is clearly active participation.
That we should be tracking. I have the JS versus Backpage, but was it another one?
Yeah, JS, that is the Washington State one. Is that what you're asking? I'm sorry, I can't even see who's
I'm back
asking.
here. Hi.
Oh, hi.
I have the JS versus Backpage, and
Yeah.
was that the only one? I thought you said something about Dart, or maybe I'm off.
So Dart is the sheriff who was out of Cook County, who was sued actually by Backpage because he tried to get the credit card companies, and he ultimately was successful, actually. And then the Massachusetts lawsuit, I don't always remember these initials perfectly, that was Doe v. Backpage.
Information. It seems when I want to do research, the young people or the people that are wanting to do the criminal activity have already moved on to something else. We have no idea what app people potentially who want to do sex trafficking are using or what else has been developed. We are still with Backpage. We don't know what the new technology
Yeah,
is.
we do. Yeah. I mean, I just gave you three like those three are three examples, and then there are all sorts of apps. There are also, I mean, the investigators are also aware of dark web sites as well. I don't do a ton of research in all of those areas. Like, I don't go on them daily or anything, but the investigators are aware of a lot of those. Realize that as we pick up victims, we get aware of more and more, and there's definitely a lot of apps that they go on as well. So we are getting more and more aware of them, but Backpage was definitely tops on everyone's list. And it maybe still will be. I mean, it's only been a month and a half.
My question is about the porn industry and how much truth there is to the statement that like a lot of the women in the porn industry are part of sex trafficking and are coerced into that, and if there's any legal action being taken against that, investigations, anything like that.
So I would say every major conference that we have, like we'll have several conferences that are day or several day-long conferences with all the folks from all around the country. We always have at least a couple presentations on porn, because to say that there's not a link, just as Renee was saying, the same thing with strip clubs, to say that there's not a link between porn and sex trafficking would be completely naive. Of course, there's a huge link between the two. I think in a couple ways. First of all, certainly women and children are, that's often the first link is for them to go into pornography. And then the next step, it's almost like a training, see if they'll be willing to do porn, see if they'll be willing to take their clothes off, and then see if they'll be willing to sleep with someone. So it's kind of a way of kind of pushing them gently into that. The other thing is that the reason that we discuss porn a lot is honestly, and I know Teresa talked about this, and I can't underscore it enough, is it's also the way that porn is now, mainstream porn, it's way different than, at least it was when I was young, where boys were trying to get a look at the centerfold of Playboy, and that was it. Mainstream porn now is very violent, very demeaning of women, and so when you see the violence and the demeaning nature that our victims are treated, a lot of them will say that the men get these predilections, or the Johns get these predilections from porn, that there's an addiction to porn. Actually, one of the presentations I went to, the gentleman said that he did a study and all of the men that were on death row had one thing in common, and it was an addiction to porn. So it definitely, the way that it is now, the way that it's overly available, the way that it's just very demeaning towards women, the way that a lot of our kids are being raised on this, and the way that they view women, I think it's all a part of that culture of how it increases demand. Certainly it increases demand, but certainly it's a stepping stone as well.
Yeah, so do you know of any legal action that's been taken against any specific websites or anything like that have been like specifically related?
Well, child porn is illegal.
Oh, yeah.
Adult porn is not. So certainly for child porn, we in Ohio have our laws, even our trafficking laws specifically include child porn in them. So that's how much there is an acknowledgement of it.
The data stripping as part of the publishing process, in the Court of Appeals decisions that you cited, whether that was distinguished at all, it seems that the data stripping is more like interference with law enforcement, which was precisely the argument or the direction that seemed to be the thrust of the argument, saying, we're being transparent. The alternative would be to drive this further underground. So I'm just wondering if it seems like there's an inconsistency there in the argument, and whether the Court of Appeals picked up on that distinction, or whether there was some precedent set in allowing that proactive activity of stripping data that impeded law enforcement to be simply wrapped into a First Amendment argument of this is simply publishing.
So they haven't responded to that part of the subpoena, so we haven't really pressed them a lot on that. I will say they did respond once to that part of the argument, and the response was, we're not intentionally stripping metadata. What we're doing is, and I don't know what you're talking about. We're not doing anything intentionally, but we do, in a lot of instances, have to conform the pictures, change the size of the pictures, and if the metadata gets lost, that's not our fault. So that is their response. And I think the government's response is, if that's true, produce your documents that show that, produce the information that shows that. So that's all I can say about that, is that there has been a response that we certainly don't intentionally strip out that metadata. Whether that's true or not, I just can't comment, but that's primarily because they haven't been willing to show their information or their documents related to that.